This story goes back to a time before the mills, a time when there was a thriving cottage industry of spinning and weaving to supply the bleach works at Seymour Hill and Lambeg. And all around the banks of the Lagan the fields were white with webs of bleached linen. 100 days. Her husband was to be hanged from the bridge at Ballyskay at noon. Nearing the hour, she and her father and younger brother Joe set off in the cart. It was expected of her to perform her last duty as a wife. Wailing and begging for pity, as many of the wives did, added to the entertainment of the crowd. Well, she thought, they'll get no satisfaction from watching me. The men were quiet as the three of them made their way along the narrow road. Joe kept his head down, his shoulders hunched. He could not meet her eyes, even as he'd helped her into the cart. As her youngest brother, she'd half reared him. In a few days he was leaving for America, his life's dream. She felt a stabbing at her heart. He too would be as good as dead to her. Looking over in the direction of the Belfast hills, she saw that work had started on pulling the flax. She remembered that the day she got married had been the start of the planting season. It was said that it took 100 days from the sowing of the seed until the pulling of the plant. So, 100 days. That was to be the length of her married life. Not long. It seemed a lifetime. She looked over at her father as he pulled on the reins to let an oncoming cart pass. He looked old. A spidery web of veins stood out on his temple. He wanted this business over and done with. It had hung like a black cloud over the family for weeks. She thought back to the time when he'd been glad that a man had come along at last and offered to marry her. A man with cold blue eyes and few words. That he had his own house, a bit of land and a loom was a godsend. There was no money in the man's background, but if her father suspected a source of extra income, he never said. She was the eldest and considered the fairest of the family, but she was slow at spinning and had been passed over in favour of her more nimble-fingered sisters, all of whom were now settled with families of their own. So her options were limited. Marriage to this man, or face long hours at the bleach works in Lambeg or Seymour Hill. They had been married a short time when she became aware of her husband's nighttime activities. It was late. She was in bed when there was a tap at the door. He was raking the fire. At the sound of the poker being set down, she closed her eyes. Feeling his proximity, she kept her breathing even. She'd become good at pretending sleep in the hope he'd leave her alone. Sometimes he did, and she was grateful to the whiskey for that. But at other times, he'd take what he wanted from her and more. She could put up with the bruises, but the suffocating feel of his hands pressing on her neck frightened the wits out of her. Hearing him lift the latch, she waited. The sound of footsteps and muffled voices could be heard outside. Slipping out of bed, she moved like a shadow across the room. He'd left the door ajar, and she inched it forward. The sharp March wind carried the voices to her. I tell you, as regular as clockwork he be. Goes in for about half an hour, and then straight out, and does the rounds up as far as Tulling Across. Meets your other fella there. She recognised the speaker as Willie Dixon, or Dickie as he was known. A neighbour married with 5 kids and another due any day. There were 3 or 4 other voices. It was clear her husband was in charge. You make sure you have the cart down yonder at the back of the hedge and be ready, he said. Pass those webs over to Dickie, and you get yourself home. It seemed to her they intended to create a diversion over Tulling Across way by keeping the night watchman occupied while the green at Lambeg was stripped of its linen. Like the stamp of a quality web, The details imprinted themselves upon her brain. If he pulled this off, he'd be able to upgrade and maybe even buy a second loom. If he didn't, well, there was a permanent reminder of the risk only down the road. She'd heard that they'd left a body swinging for 2 days on the newly erected gallows at Ballyskay. Now, as they neared the bridge, her father cursed their lateness. The carriage containing the prisoner had already arrived. Strange, she thought to herself. Already she was referring to him not as her husband, but as the prisoner. She'd said her goodbyes a few days ago. They might as well have been two strangers for all the emotion she'd seen in those blue eyes. She'd promised him she'd pray for his soul. The gathering around the bridge was lively, but for the shadow of the gallows it could have been a carnival they'd come upon. Ploughing the horse straight into the crowd, her father shouted, "Make way, come on now, show a bit of respect." Neighbours helped to make a path for them towards the river bank, a spot reserved for the family of the condemned. In the distance, she saw Willie Dixon's wife. She felt sorry for the woman. It was rumoured that it was Dickie who'd snitched. He hadn't taken part in the robbery, and although he'd swore he'd been ill that night, she knew that his fate was as good as sealed. He'd be found face down in a ditch some day. A shiver ran through her. Pulling her shawl up around her shoulders, she ignored the curious eyes and snide remarks. Her father seemed to feel the need to defend her lack of emotion. Aye, can't you see she's in shock? She can't take in what's happening. Old Ma Stewart gave her a potion. Aye, it's put her out of herself, it has. She descended from the cart as the charges were being read out. Bowing her head, she closed her eyes, expecting a prayer at the end. But instead the crowd were asked, "Any of you's got messages for friends in hell? Shout them out now, this man will pass them on." There were hoots of laughter and jeering. Then a silence fell. She could feel the air heavy with expectancy. A gasp went up around her. Someone somewhere said, "God rest his soul." It was over. Lifting her head without once looking near the gallows, she saw Joe watching her. This time he did not look away, but his eyes held a sadness she would always remember. She hoped life would be good to him in the new world. At least he would have money, a substantial amount of money. Tomorrow, the day before he set sail, he would lift the reward for the information he'd given to the authorities. She remembered the night she'd begged him to do it. He'd been shocked and refused until she'd shown him the marks on her neck and told him she feared for her life. She moved towards where her father was making ready for the journey home. Pulling herself up into the cart, she felt a lightness inside of her as she thought to herself, just 100 days, and now she was a widow. She was free.